Today's episode is powered by Listen, a groundbreaking AI platform transforming how child welfare and other public sector providers learn and grow. Imagine being able to roll out comprehensive, secure training and quality monitoring across your entire organization instantly. That's exactly what Listen delivers to over 70 public and private sector clients. Developed by PhD academic psychologists, Listen helps health and human services agencies master motivational interviewing and other evidence-based practices. And this isn't just another training tool. It's backed by 16 years of rigorous research and peer-reviewed studies. To learn more, visit listen.io. That's LYSSN.io. LYSSN.io. Or follow the link in the show notes.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook and Twitter at @theimprintnews. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts, including the new one, Young and Autonomous. We talked to some of the hosts last week here. You can find all that on safecampaudio.org on the web, at SafeCamp Audio on social media. So I flipped it around. Usually we do the headlines edition of the podcast in the first week of the month. I wanted to feature our conversation with Sasha Klein from Michigan State about Head Start last week, since it was in the news. So we did that, and now we'll do headlines this week. And as we've been doing on these headline episodes for a while, let's try and get everybody up to speed on the frenetic pace of activity coming out of Washington, D.C. these days between the Trump administration, mostly, and Congress starting to get in gear on some consequential things as well. I'm going to hit on three sort of distinct lanes of things going on in this update. The first is what the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, and the Office of Management and Budget are doing in regards to present-day staff at federal agencies that are of import to, both child welfare and youth justice, and then also present-day grants, so funding that has already been approved by Congress for previous fiscal years and what's going on with that. The second we'll talk about is the president's budget request, which has yet to be shown in its full form. We got what's called the kind of a skinny budget, outlining a few things they plan to cut or raise. That's about it so far. And then the third is Congress's aims to cut spending overall in what's called reconciliation. So we'll hit on all three of those. Let's start with what's been going on with DOGE and the Office of Management and Budget. Mostly, I think DOGE is the kind of forward group, that's become the face of what we're going to talk about here. In all these cases, everything I'm going to talk about, the Imprint reporters have been doggedly following this, trying to explain to our readers what is going on and what the impact is. So suffice to say at the top, everything I'm about to kind of just give you an overview on, much better detail in the pages of the Imprint, imprintnews.org. And I will put links to all of our recent coverage of the Trump administration and what's going on in the show notes for this. So, as you're probably aware from just mainstream media coverage and some of what we've talked about already on this podcast, the DOGE office has really been running point on different approaches to downsizing the amount of federal workers that there are in this country. Really began with early offers of what I think they termed a fork in the road, where they were basically essentially offering to buy out workers who were willing to sort of agree to just go away of their own volition. They could pay out to do so. After that, there was an effort to cut probationary workers, which sounds like it's like all brand new workers. That's actually really not the case. In some cases it is. But for example, if you worked for the Department of Education and hopped over to the Department of Justice or the Department of Health and Human Services in the last year, you would be considered a probationary worker, even if you had, 15 years in the government, I'm pretty sure is sort of how that works. So that was the second tranche, was to release probation workers or probation status workers. Now, when it comes to the issue of child welfare, the largest agency of import in the federal government is the Administration for Children and Families. That is a very sizable faction within the Department of Health and Human Services. It has all of the funding that really directly supports child welfare systems. So when you think of like Title 4E, which is the big entitlement that helps states pay for foster care or adoption, preventing foster care now, thanks to the Family First Act, things that are very tethered to child welfare specifically, but then also all of the family assistance that we hope keeps families from ever coming into the child welfare orbit in some cases. So things like the temporary assistance for needy families, TANF, and Social Services Block Grant, LIHEAP, the low income heating program. We'll talk about some of these a little bit later, but anyway, ACF is the largest star in the solar system when it comes to, family services. They had about 200 probationary status workers let go. That happened around Valentine's Day in mid-February there. And then on April 1st, so yet another kind of weird holiday that this happened around, about 500 workers from the Administration for Children and Families received what was called a reduction in force notice, which told them essentially you are effective immediately on administrative leave. And the termination date for most, or I believe all of these workers, was set for June 2nd. I'm saying about these numbers, like about 200, about 500, because there's not really been this sort of, transparent rundown from the Trump administration of exactly how many people are being let go in various agencies or anything like that. So it's really just kind of like folks who, are close to the, folks at ACF or who might have worked there in some places, just trying to keep as best tabs as possible so that people know what's going on. And so what we have received from that group, like in terms of information, shows that ACF, back in January had about 2,400 workers. They are now down to about 1,500. So through the process of being offered buyouts, people taking those buyouts, laying off probationary status workers, and then putting in a reduction in force notice on April 5th, they have basically taken about 30 to 40% of the ACF workforce and either, terminated them, persuaded them to leave, or have them on admin leave pending termination now. Our reporters, Sarah Tiano and Michael Fitzgerald, have just put up a story that, as I said, I'll put in the show notes. I just wanted to read one quick paragraph from that story, which will give you the gist of, exactly how chaotic that experience has been. It has not exactly been just a very planful thing to have happened, or as experienced by the people who receive these reduction in force notices. So I'm just going to read this section, which is based on, their extensive interviewing of several people who have experienced these reduction in forces. Though unconnected and working in separate offices and programs across the country from one another, the four shared identical details. There was no transparency about how, why, or when restructuring and terminations would take place. Paperwork notifying employees of termination was shoddy and full of inaccurate information, and staffers had no time to alert the state agencies they served or prepare them for the upheaval to come. And I'm just going to also quickly read a comment that Naomi Goldstein, who for a long time was a research chief with the Administration for Children and Families, how she described the upheaval, for these employees as significant, but kind of also hit on just what the impact was going to be for families in her perspective. And I'm quoting Ms. Goldstein from our story. These are stealth policy decisions. If there is nobody left to push the button to make grants for essential services like childcare, child abuse investigations, or child abuse prevention, then states, territories, tribes, and localities will not have money to provide those services. Instead of policy change, they just fire all the people, and that work doesn't get done. That's an important story people outside the government don't realize. So I think what you take away from that read the story. I would really encourage that because I'm not going to do as good a job summarizing exactly what our reporters got to here. But, the gist is this was something that was happening over a period of months in a way that caused a lot of stress and angst among the workforce at ACF. I think, it's pretty clear when you look at the patterns of where the reduction in forces were targeted that, ultimately Doge and the administration have an idea of some sort of strategic way they wanted to downsize ACF. I guess what I mean is the decisions of where to cut do not seem capricious to me. They cut back on, for example, regional offices. They had said they were planning to downsize the number of regional offices that work with states. They downsized greatly on the Head Start staff and the staff who work on the social services block grant. These are programs in some cases where, they've discussed cutting the budget at different points. So I think that the decision of what to cut or where to cut within ACF, they had an idea about. What was random was who was let go, because in the sense that if you just happened to be working for Head Start, really whether or not you were one of the best employees at ACF or one of the worst, that's hypothetical here, it was the fact that you were working for Head Start at the time, or the fact that you were working in a regional office that put you in the crosshairs and got you a reduction in force notice. It really had nothing to do with the merit or service over time, or they were not making assessments of who is the best person to stay or go from this agency. Now, I should point out, as I mentioned, the target date for these employees to be fully terminated was early June. Just on Friday or Saturday, I think, of last week, a U.S. District Judge in California, Susan Ilston, put a 2-week pause on terminations like this being carried out by Doge. Her comment, in the order, it is the prerogative of presidents to pursue new policy priorities and to imprint their stamp on the federal government, but to make large-scale overhauls of federal agencies, any president must enlist the help of his co-equal branch and partner, the Congress. So that's a 2-week reprieve. It did not read to me like it retroactively changes the status of anybody that has already happened to. It does sound like she was ordering, a pause and any further actions on this. But this, like everything we're going to talk about here, really is tied up in court. There are just dozens of lawsuits challenging some of the sort of frenetic actions that are coming out of the Trump administration. So a lot of this stuff is really going to be wait and see, but that is basically what's going on in terms of the workforce. Now, there have been some grants and contracts coming out of the Administration for Children and Families that we have talked about already on the podcast that have been frozen or canceled, but there has not been what I would describe as sort of like a wholesale freezing or cancellation or termination of grants coming out of that agency yet. Now, on the flip side of that, another, organization of consequence for what we cover here at the Imprint is in the Department of Justice, and it's called the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. That is sort of like itself a smaller piece of the Office of Justice programs. Now, it's sort of like a mirror image of the experience of ACF. They have, as far as I know, not really seen any reduction in force actions taking place. We haven't seen, a mass layoff or anything close to that at the Office of Juvenile Justice, but we have seen a very large number of grants out there in the world going to nonprofits and schools and other operators that are, existing grants going on from fiscal years past, including the most recent fiscal year, that have just been terminated and stopped in their tracks. There's a really good breakdown of what exactly happened with these grant terminations from the Center on Criminal Justice that I'll link to in the show notes. The original reporting on these grant terminations, we were one of the first outlets to report on it. It kind of stemmed from this email that came out from the acting head of the Office of Justice Programs, basically telling her staff that these terminations were made to cut things that were no longer in line, essentially, with the priorities of the Justice Department under the Trump administration. Quickly, there kind of emerged a list. I think Reuters got first, of about 360 or so grants that had been terminated by the Justice Department. The Council on Criminal Justice Assessment went a little deeper, found 373 grants that had been defunded. They valued those grants at a total of $820 million. But it's worth noting, many of those were multi-year grants that were in kind of various stages of payout. So it wasn't like right all at once, $820 million was cut, but they did assess and estimate that about 500 million was kind of forward looking. So there was a loss of 500 million. Now we went through, and I'll link to our reporting, which was led by Nell Bernstein. We went through and identified about 6 grants that were directly impacting, children, teens, and young adults. Obviously, there's lots of Justice Department grants that at least tangentially impact those people, but we found about 60 grants that affect kids and teens and things like that, totaling about $168 million. Just a few examples off the top: the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges had 15 million in grants canceled across a number of grants. The Galt Center, which trains and supports youth defenders around the country, had an $800,000 grant eliminated. The National Prison Rape Elimination Act Resource Center, which works with states and systems to help ensure that locked facilities are in fact safe from sexual violence, including youth facilities. That's run by Impact Justice, which administered the center. They lost more than $8 million, not just on that, but on a number of grants. And then, a few of the grants that come out of the Justice Department actually impact child welfare. One of those was, a multi-million-dollar grant for court-appointed special advocates, or the National CASA office. As we have written about in the Imprint over the last year or so, they had some of their funds frozen by the Justice Department as they went through some audits. And the Justice Department in the previous administration had some questions about their use of funding and things like that. They had kind of just gotten back on track, I think, a little bit. And now their funding has been terminated. And that's a big deal because that grant from the Justice Department is an enormous percentage of their operating capital. So we will obviously stay on that and the impacts of these grant terminations on all these organizations. It really is mostly in the youth justice world, the terminations focused in on the national actors that were doing sort of training and technical assistance type stuff, more so than, local grantees who were carrying out direct services. Liz Ryan, who ran the Office of Juvenile Justice for the Biden administration, told Nell Bernstein for the story that we ran and that I will link in the show notes. Her fear was that this is really just a first act, and she expects that there really could be more cuts coming. But like I said, when we were talking about the workforce, there is an actual basic appeal process for the grantees who have been terminated. I expect that a lot of them will appeal. I certainly expect that my guess would be that there's also going to be lawsuits, if there aren't already, pushing back on these actions in the same way that folks are pushing back on reduction in force. Just along the legal argument, you need to actually consult Congress, especially when it's about money that they have already instructed to use for. I'll also link to just a quick story we did on the reaction to that from a group of Democratic senators, dozens of them, who have asked for answers from the Justice Department on exactly what the decision-making process was for which grants were terminated. That letter strongly recommends that they just simply restore the grants, but they outlined, several questions that they wanted answers to on a short time turnaround. We'll follow up if and when those senators get their information and that sees the light of day. In addition to these grants that are terminated, I think there's one other, aspect that's sort of at the nexus of this quest to reduce the workforce and a quest to root out funding that the administration doesn't align with their view of things, is what I would call kind of slow walking or delays in grants. So not outright termination, but I will link to Michael Fitzgerald's story, kind of examining what's going on with Head Start, which we talked about at length last week on the show. Head Start was in an early draft of Health and Human Services spending priorities for next year, zeroed out. It seems to have made its way back into the Trump administration's budget for next year. But meanwhile, the funding release of existing money for Head Start has been choppy and has, as Fitzgerald reports, contributed to at least one organization, one Head Start provider, closing its doors. And I have heard from some sources that the social services block grant funding, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute here, some of the money from the last 2 quarters has still not gone out yet to states. So there's the reduction in workforce, there are terminations of grants, but then kind of in between, you've got this funding that they have not explicitly ended, but seems to be stuck in the pipeline, likely in some cases, because there are fewer people to actually oversee the distribution of money. That stuff doesn't just go off on an automatic timer. People have to approve the release of funds and things like that. All right, so that was sort of the Doge and Trump administration actions in the moment on reductions in the workforce, on freezing grants or terminating them.
Caseworkers are stretched thin, balancing high caseloads and endless paperwork. But with SpeakRight, documentation doesn't have to mean burnout. SpeakRight's protective services transcription cuts paperwork time dramatically, so you can meet deadlines, reduce overtime, and focus on what truly matters, the families you serve. With SpeakRight's free mobile app and desktop platform, caseworkers can capture detailed narratives anytime, anywhere, with just one tap to upload. SpeakRight is proven to lower stress and turnover, helping agencies retain dedicated staff while improving case quality. Don't let documentation slow you down. Let SpeakRight do the heavy lifting. Visit speakright.com/imprint to see how SpeakRight can transform your agency today. That's SpeakRight, SpeakWrite.com/imprint.
Now let's talk more about the future-looking discussions around federal funding, and that really is happening right now on 2 different tracks. So you have the reconciliation process. Now, that involves big picture changes to the money coming in and out of government through taxes, through debt, spending. So this is a process where, existential questions about programs and tax cuts and big picture policies come into play. You've probably heard references to, from President Trump and others about a big, beautiful bill. The reason that they want to do something like a big, beautiful bill is because the reconciliation process is sort of the one chance every year that, the executive branch or members of the kind of ruling party or the majority party in Congress can get things passed without having to worry about a filibuster. You only need 51 votes to pass a reconciliation bill. And so it's the best chance to get kind of big things done every year now. Now, a reconciliation bill is already in the works. I've heard that it could come out even before you are listening to it. It's really expected to come out early this week and then quickly move to getting marked up and move through both chambers of Congress. And this might be where you would see a push for really actual elimination or enormous downsizing of government programs. I'd say the one that most people are certain will be proposed for elimination is the social services block grant, which I mentioned in the last segment, just talking about how the money has kind of that's been allocated has been frozen up for the last quarter or so and isn't really getting out. Early signs were that, an elimination of social services block grant was going to be on the table when it came to reconciliation. We'll see if that happens. It's about $1.7 billion. A lot of that money, I think about a third of social services block grant ends up going into, serving children who are involved in the child welfare system and other at-risk youth. It's about 10% of all federal spending on child welfare. SSBG, which is kind of the acronym it's known for, is really kind of think of it as like the glue or duct tape aspect of the federal outlay when it comes to, just the social safety net. It is really flexible. There's like these big picture, dozens of categories that you can use the money for. And so that is most likely to face elimination through this reconciliation process. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which is, since 1996, has essentially been the federal welfare program. Very, very unlikely that it would see anything like an existential just elimination or anything like that. But I think it's possible we could see a cut proposed to the program. It's been the subject of, a series of hearings around the way that it's used by states and potential points of fraud and waste for several months now. So those are two to watch. The biggest thing that people will be watching with the reconciliation process, though, is Medicaid. I'm not going to talk too much about that today because the next two guests on the podcast are both focused on Medicaid and its impact both on child welfare systems and the broader efforts to address child behavioral health in ways that might prevent kids from ever coming into the orbit of child welfare in some cases, and just overall, anyway, I don't want to step on those two guests. It's really going to be some good stuff. So check back on that. But big picture here, the rules have been set up for this reconciliation process in a way where, let's put it this way, they're calling for hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to the Centers on Medicaid and Medicare Services that most experts agree it would just be impossible to achieve without a downsizing of Medicaid, which, like I said, we'll get into in depth in the next two episodes of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, but is, just an enormous star in the sky when it comes to how we are serving young people and families in America. Just in child welfare alone, every kid in foster care is categorically eligible for Medicaid through age 26. It's a payer on all kinds of services outside of just that. So that is going to be the biggest piece of the reconciliation pie when it comes to what we write about here at the Imprint. So that is the big picture reconciliation process. And then there's, of course, the sort of year-to-year effort to fund the government, which in more cases than not lately leads to an inability to do that, followed by several continuing resolutions. In this fiscal year that we're in right now, basically we have not had any spending agreement for the entirety of it, and we will not, because we're under a continuing resolution right now that funds the government all the way till the end of the fiscal year at the end of September. But let's talk about sort of what will be on the table for fiscal year 2026, since that's the next one coming up. Now, the president's budget proposal is really kind of the starting gun for the annual spending appropriations process. So everyone's sort of been waiting around for that. Usually the president's budget proposal, by my memory, usually comes out in like February or March. We're now in May, heading into mid-May, and still have not seen an enormous, voluminous outline of the spending proposals of the government. Usually that's what you see. You see, several documents. If you go to like the president's Office of Management and Budget site, there'll be, the overall budget. There'll be an explainer on it. There'll be all kinds of appendices where you can see all kinds of very specific things. That has yet to come out. They have put out what's sort of called a skinny budget that really focuses in only on the discretionary funding and what they plan to increase, and in more cases than not, with this administration, what they plan to either eliminate or cut greatly. So I'm just going to go over a few of those things that seem to be on the table just based on what came out in that skinny budget proposal. I think the biggest headline to me, or the thing that is kind of the common thread in this discretionary budget outline that they've put out, is sort of consolidation with an eye towards cuts. You see a lot of different departments that impact youth and families where the administration is proposing something around the idea of consolidating several programs into one big entity and projecting a cost savings or a spending cut as a result. So I'll just go through a few examples of that. One is what seems to be kind of the priority project for HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., his creation of the Administration for a Healthy America, which I really want to pronounce it AHA. Or is it AHA? I don't know. but it's the AHA. And really what it does is it's a $500 million proposed entity within the Department of Health and Human Services that will roll up a bunch of different existing kind of programs and agencies. And then I would imagine also, take on some new priorities as set by Kennedy. The administration describes this, whole effort at AHA as to tackle nutrition, physical activity, healthy lifestyles, over-reliance on medication and treatments, the effects of new technological habits, environmental impacts, food and drug quality and safety across HHS. One of the entities that is planned for roll up into AHA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which I think is about a $7 billion agency. And they are proposing to cut out about $1 billion and change from that and roll the $5.7 billion that they're keeping into the AHA. So that's one. The Education Department, Title I, is consolidating a whole bunch of things. In the Department of Labor, there is the creation of what they're calling the Make America Skilled Again grant consolidation that pulls together several workforce development programs, but then cuts $1.6 billion from their cumulative 2020 value. Now, there's no specifics on which programs are included there, but if it was approved by Congress, might spell the end of several delineated kind of funding streams for youth, namely under the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act or through Youth Build. Those are two Labor Department programs that could be part of this grant consolidation. There weren't specifics in the outline. At the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the sort of headline there was this plan to turn Section 8 and the rest of the federal sort of rental assistance programs into a big state block grant, which the administration is arguing will reduce total spending by $26.7 billion. So that's honestly probably the biggest single cut that they are proposing within this discretionary budget plan. The idea there is to kind of let these states design their own plans, but also impose a 2-year cap on able-bodied adults to access the rental assistance money, which they argue will ensure, and I'm quoting here from the proposal, a majority of rental assistance funding through states would go to the elderly and disabled. One thing worth noting within the Housing and Urban Development Department is that there was a very small line at the end that basically said, well, we're doing this enormous block granting consolidation. And again, I'm quoting here from the plan, 25 million in housing guarantees for youth aging out of foster care, unquote, is guaranteed within their plan, which we can only assume refers to the existing Foster Youth to Independence program. That was established during the first Trump administration. It was designed by current and former foster youth and kind of shepherded along by the HUD team under former Secretary Ben Carson. There's been some reporting that this line got in there at the request or insistence of the First Lady, Melania Trump, who's made foster youth a sort of focal point of her sort of portfolio in this administration, as she did in the last one. In terms of sizable cuts that they are proposing to discretionary programs, there's a $274 million cut to maternal and child health programs. There is a proposed $674 million cut to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Like I said, any real substantive changes to Medicaid are going to come through that reconciliation bill, but this is a proposal of cutting money, that they're arguing is really about getting rid of old Biden administration priorities and would not actually impact anybody's coverage. That's what they're saying. There's also a $2 billion less being included in this budget request than last year for the Unaccompanied Children's Program, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast. This is essentially really the only national federally run foster care system. It is for children arriving at the border without parents, without a guardian, in search of some form of asylum. The way that works is that Border Patrol, processes these kids and moves them over to this network of providers funded and overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services. Their job is to provide shelter and care and education and all those things as we're working to find sponsors for children in the country as they seek asylum and go through that process and all that stuff. The number of children arriving unaccompanied, really the number of people arriving in search of asylum at the border has plummeted. So not really surprising to see this big cut. I mean, the amount of money going to unaccompanied children has been quite a ride since 2013. It was like 300 million and change during the Obama administration and skyrocketed at first up to 800 million as we saw, this massive swell of kids coming in unaccompanied in search of protection. And then that crept into the billions pretty quickly through both the Trump and Biden administrations as there was just a much higher demand for services or a need for services. So, my information talking to some people that are involved with the unaccompanied program is just that it's far, far, far less kids to serve right now. And so they just don't need as much infrastructure as they have had in previous years. Then slated for elimination by the Trump administration, you have the $770 million community services block grant. You have the $315 million preschool development plan, elimination of the TRIO programs, which is a collective of federally funded outreach services designed to help individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds, including youth who have experienced the justice system or foster care, to pursue higher education and to get onto college campuses. And that's a $1.6 billion program in its entirety. We mentioned a consolidation of workforce programs that might downsize or affect programs for youth. One part that is not in the plans for that consolidation by the Trump administration is Job Corps, which isn't for youth, but definitely serves a lot of young adults, some of whom are system impacted for sure. That's a $1.6 billion program that they plan to eliminate in their budget. They call it a failed experiment to help America's youth that, quote, in some cases has harmed them. And then definitely the big surprise within this was what is not proposed to be eliminated. We had seen early drafts of HHS language around the budget that had zeroed out Head Start, which we talked about with Sasha Klein last week. That's about a $12 to $13 billion appropriation every year for that program. It serves, hundreds of thousands of kids. I think it's served like 40 million over its history, dating back to the 60s. In leaked early drafts, not in the final plans here. So as of the skinny budget put out by the Trump administration, Head Start is not slated for any type of change. We'll see when the full details of the budget come out, which again could happen this week. I mean, we could see the reconciliation bill start to move quickly, boom, right into the president's ask for fiscal 2026. And then we're off and running on both of these things. So it could be a very consequential week. We may have to do like an emergency headlines before. I don't know if I can wait a full month to get back into it and not talk to listeners about that. All right, last item for this week. We have new-ish data on the number of kids in foster care, and it indicates that in fiscal year 2023, we saw a fairly sizable decrease in the number of kids who were in foster care systems around the country. So according to a press release put out very late last week by the Administration for Children and Families, the number of kids in foster care on the last day of fiscal 2023 was 343,077 children. That is a decrease of nearly 7% from fiscal year 2022, which was the most recent numbers we had through what is called AFCARS. That stands for Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. There was also some numbers in the press release about entries into foster care. Those totaled 175,283. That is also a decrease of about 6.1% from fiscal year 2022. This press release also says that effective this week, so we'll see this reconciliation bill and a budget ask from the Trump administration, will also apparently be privy to a new interactive dashboard that, per the press release from ACF, will be designed to, quote, share foster care data with stakeholders and the public in a transparent and user-friendly way, end quote. That is welcome news if it is going to happen. The AFCARS data has been laggy, to put it mildly. Like, we're just getting fiscal 2023 numbers. Generally, that's come out sometime around February. The promise here is that it's going to come out in May, and it's going to be for the year preceding the AFCARS report each year, which would actually kind of step it up by quite a bit. So we're not waiting a year and a half in some cases for these numbers. There was another quote in this press release that caught our collective eye here at the Imprint. This is from Andrew Grattison, who's the acting head of the Administration for Children and Families right now. And he is talking here about the general decline in kids coming into foster care, kids in foster care. We continue to see a decline in children entering care. but we will celebrate reduced numbers of children in foster care only when we see corresponding indicators of improved child safety. The only true measure of success is fewer children harmed by abuse and neglect. I think the reason that was like a little surprising of a comment was that we actually do have an entire other federal report that every year produces data around how many kids have been confirmed as victims of abuse and neglect. It's called the Child Maltreatment Report. It's just that title with the year every year. So the most recent one is Child Maltreatment 2023. And what that report has found of late is that we've continued to hit a record low number of confirmed victims of abuse and neglect. It was 546,159 in 2023. That was a 2% decrease from 2022. And that report, the last one, was the fifth straight year that the number of maltreatment victims has declined. The total is down like 20% over that period. So, to the extent that that would be construed to be the only true measure of success, I think there are certainly people who have different views on why the confirmation of abuse or neglect might have changed. It's the number we have. I'm not sure if Mr. Gradison has another one in mind. So that was just an interesting statement, and I expect that perhaps he'll expound a little bit more on what he's seeing in federal data when the report comes out and this new interactive dashboard comes out this week. I believe it's expected for May 13th. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'd like to thank Listen for sponsoring this episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.